At 0847 hours on December 18, 1943, 23,000 feet over the Ruhr Valley, Lieutenant Dennis Horvath had a Focke-Wulf 190 lined up in his gun sight. Perfect firing position. 300 yards, zero deflection, textbook setup. Every training manual said this was the moment. This was the kill. Horvath's right index finger squeezed the trigger. One gun fired. The sound was wrong immediately. A single .50 caliber Browning barked once. The other 7 guns stayed silent. 1 gun out of 8. Horvath squeezed harder. Nothing. The FW-190 pilot saw the pathetic single tracer stream and understood instantly what had happened. The German reversed hard right, rolled inverted, came back around. Horvath tried to follow, but his aircraft felt sluggish, heavy. The FW-190 was already firing. 20mm cannon rounds walked up Horvath's right wing. Metal shrieked. The wing root shuddered. 2 rounds punched clean through. 1 went through the aileron. Horvath felt the aircraft buck sideways. His wingman, Lieutenant Carl Brenner, called over the radio. Calm at first, then urgent. Brenner had turned to help, but a second FW-190 was already on him. Horvath watched Brenner's P-47 take hits to the engine cowling. Black smoke poured out. Brenner's Pratt and Whitney radial was dying. Horvath tried to help. Tried to get his guns working. His finger hammered the trigger. Still nothing. 7 guns silent. Useless. He could smell the cordite from the single gun that had fired, acrid and bitter in the cockpit. Could feel the cold seeping through his flight suit. -20 degrees Fahrenheit at altitude. The kind of cold that made your fingers ache inside heated gloves. The kind of cold that made metal contract and springs seize. Horvath keyed his radio. His voice stayed level through training and discipline. "My guns are jammed. Repeat, all guns jammed." The admission felt like a death sentence. For Brenner, it was. Brenner's P-47 nosed over, trailing black smoke. The aircraft fell through 19,000 feet, 18,000, 17,000. Horvath watched until Brenner disappeared into the cloud deck below. No parachute, no radio call. Just gone. Horvath turned for home. The FW-190s didn't follow. They'd gotten what they came for. Horvath counted bullet holes during the flight back. 47 hits. His right wing looked like Swiss cheese. His tail section had taken cannon fire. He landed at Bodny Airfield at 09:53 hours, 2 hours and 6 minutes after takeoff. Brenner didn't come back. Brenner wasn't coming back. And Horvath's guns hadn't fired when he needed them. The P-47 Thunderbolt carried 8 Browning M2 .50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing. Combined rate of fire, 800 rounds per minute per gun, 6,400 rounds per minute total. On paper, the most heavily armed American fighter in Europe. On paper, devastating firepower. On paper, something that should have dominated the skies over Germany. In reality, the P-47 had a problem that was killing American pilots every single day. Gun jamming rate of 38% on the first trigger pull at altitude. 38%. More than 1 in 3 pilots pulled the trigger and got nothing. Or worse, got 1 gun firing while 7 stayed silent. By the time a pilot cleared the jam manually, or cycled the charging handles, or did whatever desperate troubleshooting he could manage in combat, the firing opportunity was gone. The German fighter had reversed position. The tables had turned. The hunter became the hunted. November 1943, 34 P-47 pilots killed in combat. December 1943, 29 pilots killed. 63 total deaths in 2 months. After-action reports from the 8th Air Force told the same story over and over. The phrase, "guns failed to fire at critical moment," appeared in 41 incident reports between November 1st and December 15th. 41 times pilots reported getting into perfect firing positions only to have their weapons malfunction. Some of those pilots made it home, some didn't. The mechanical problem was simple. The Browning M2 recoil springs were designed for ground-level temperatures, standard operating conditions. The specifications were written at sea level, tested at sea level, approved at sea level. But combat didn't happen at sea level. Combat happened at 20,000 feet. Combat happened at 25,000 feet. Combat happened in air so cold that exposed skin would freeze in seconds. At those altitudes, air temperature dropped to negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Sometimes negative 30. The metal contracted. The recoil springs, designed for temperate conditions, became stiffer. Spring tension increased beyond design parameters. The ammunition belts had the same problem. Designed for temperate conditions, the metal links became rigid in extreme cold. When a pilot pulled the trigger, the bolt would chamber the first round. Fire it. But then the feeding cycle would fail. The belt wouldn't advance. The next round wouldn't chamber. The bolt jammed halfway through its travel. The gun went silent. One round fired, then nothing. 7 other guns experienced the same failure simultaneously. The pilot had 2 options: abort the attack to manually clear the jam, or continue fighting with whatever guns still worked. Usually none. The blame cycle was predictable and pointless. Fighter command said pilots weren't maintaining their weapons properly, blamed inadequate pre-flight procedures, blamed insufficient cleaning, blamed everything except the actual problem. Pilots said the guns were defective, said the weapons didn't work, said they were being sent into combat with equipment that failed at the worst possible moment. Republic Aviation, the company that built the P-47, said the guns met all specification requirements in testing. They had the data. They had the test results. The guns worked perfectly in controlled conditions. Ground level, controlled temperature, no combat stress, no negative 30-degree cold. Nobody was testing at 23,000 feet because the specifications didn't require it. The gap between specification and reality was killing American pilots. And nobody in the official chain of command seemed to understand why. Lieutenant Thomas Richter died on November 14th over Bremen. He jumped a FW-190, gotten into perfect firing position, pulled the trigger. His guns jammed, all 8. The FW-190 reversed and shot Richter down. He was 23 years old, from Wisconsin. His family received a telegram that said he died in combat. The telegram didn't mention that his guns hadn't worked. Captain Frank Morrison died on November 28th. Experienced pilot, 11 kills. He'd caught an Me-109 damaged and fleeing. Perfect target. Pulled the trigger. Guns jammed. The Me-109 escaped. 3 minutes later, a second Me-109 caught Morrison from behind and killed him. Morrison had been in command for 8 months. Everyone in the squadron respected him. Everyone thought he'd make it home. The Me-109 that killed him probably wouldn't have been there if Morrison's guns had fired when they were supposed to. Ensign David Chen got a perfect deflection shot on a German bomber attacking a B-17 formation on December 3rd. 1 gun fired. The bomber went down anyway. But Chen couldn't protect the B-17 because 7 of his 8 guns were silent. The bomber's rear gunner had put rounds into the B-17's No. 3 engine before Chen's single working gun finally hit him. The B-17 made it back to England, but barely. Chen filed a report. The engineering officer told him to clean his guns more thoroughly. Staff Sergeant Raymond Kowalski was 28 years old. 23rd Fighter Group, Bodney Airfield, England. He'd been maintaining P-47s for 6 months since arriving from the States in June 1943. Before the war, Kowalski worked as a tool and die maker at Ford Motor Company in Detroit. He understood metal, understood how materials behaved under stress, understood tolerances and specifications and the difference between what worked in a factory and what worked in the real world. He'd enlisted in December 1942 when the draft board finally called his number. Could have gotten a deferment for essential war work. But Kowalski figured making aircraft in England was more essential than making car parts in Michigan. His specialty was troubleshooting mechanical failures. When something broke and nobody could figure out why, they called Kowalski. He had a gift for looking at a failed component and understanding what had killed it. Not just that it failed, but why it failed. Saw patterns other mechanics missed. He'd first noticed the gun jamming pattern in August 1943. Every gun jam report came from missions above 20,000 feet. Every single one. Every successful gun operation occurred below 15,000 feet. The correlation was obvious to anyone actually looking at the data. Temperature-dependent failure. Textbook mechanical problem. But nobody in command was looking at the data. They were looking at maintenance logs and pilot error reports and blaming everyone except the actual problem. Kowalski's background gave him an advantage other mechanics didn't have. Tool and die work required understanding metal properties under temperature stress. Ford had sent him to cold weather engine testing in Michigan winters. He'd watched engines fail in 20 below cold, watched metal contract, watched spring seize, watched lubrication turn to sludge. The P-47 gun problem looked identical to cold weather automotive failures he'd seen 100 times. The solution should have been obvious. He worked on 12 aircraft in his squadron, knew every pilot personally. Lieutenant Horvath talked about his wife back in Ohio, showed Kowalski photos of her and their daughter. Lieutenant Brenner discussed cars with Kowalski, both of them Detroit natives. Both of them grew up working on engines. Captain Morrison always brought Kowalski coffee before pre-flight checks. Said it kept both of them sharp. These weren't abstract casualties in a report. These were men Kowalski saw every morning. Men who trusted him to keep their aircraft flying. Men who climbed into cockpits and flew into combat and came back shot full of holes because their guns hadn't worked when they needed them. The frustration mounted with every report. September, 6 gun jam reports from his aircraft. October, 11 reports. November, 14 reports. Each report meant a pilot who couldn't defend himself. Each report meant a pilot who might not come back. Each report was another failure of equipment that should have been fixed before it killed someone. Kowalski researched cold weather weapon designs. The Springfield rifle used variable tension recoil springs for winter operations. Simple technology. Springs that maintained consistent tension across temperature ranges. The modification was straightforward. Replace the standard recoil springs with variable tension springs. Add insulated ammunition belt covers borrowed from winter warfare equipment. Institute pre-flight heating procedures. 30 minutes of gun heating before takeoff. Total cost per aircraft, $14 in parts, 30 minutes of labor. That was it. $14 to stop pilots from dying. On October 15, 1943, Kowalski submitted a formal modification proposal to Republic Aviation. He included technical drawings, cost analysis, implementation timeline. Everything an engineering department would need to evaluate the modification. He sent it through official channels. Did everything by the book. Then he waited for a response while he kept working on aircraft that were killing pilots. Kowalski submitted his proposal on October 15, 1943. The acknowledgement came back 7 days later. October 22nd, a single-page letter from Republic Aviation's Engineering Division. Your proposal has been received and is under review. Please allow 4 to 6 weeks for evaluation. Kowalski filed the letter in his locker and went back to work. 6 weeks. He could wait 6 weeks. Men had waited longer for things that mattered less. On November 1st, he asked the engineering officer if there had been any update from Republic. The officer checked his files and said to be patient. The review process took time. Republic received hundreds of proposals from field mechanics. They had to evaluate each one carefully. Kowalski nodded and left the office. Patient. He could be patient. But pilots were still dying. November 15th. Still waiting. Still watching pilots come back from missions with gun jam reports. Still watching the maintenance logs fill up with incident after incident. Lieutenant Horvath. Guns jammed at 22,000 feet. Lieutenant Baker. Guns jammed at 24,000 feet. Ensign Whitfield. Guns jammed at 19,000 feet. Same problem. Same altitude range. Same temperature conditions. And Republic Aviation was still reviewing his proposal. November 28th, Captain Morrison died. Morrison, who brought Kowalski coffee every morning. Morrison, who'd flown 32 missions and survived everything the Luftwaffe threw at him. Morrison, who caught an Me-109 damaged and fleeing and pulled the trigger and got nothing. His guns jammed at the moment he needed them most. The Me-109 escaped. 3 minutes later, a second Me-109 caught Morrison from behind. Morrison's P-47 went down over the Ruhr Valley. No parachute, no radio call, just gone. Kowalski heard about it from Murphy during the afternoon maintenance shift. Murphy said it quietly, like saying it quietly would make it hurt less. Morrison's aircraft had been one of Kowalski's. One of the 12 P-47s he maintained personally. The guns had been clean. The maintenance logs showed proper servicing. Everything by the book. Everything according to Republic Aviation specifications. And Morrison was dead anyway because those specifications were written for conditions that didn't exist in combat. December 1st. Still no response from Republic Aviation. 6 weeks had passed. The review period was over. Kowalski asked the engineering officer again. The officer made a phone call, waited on hold for 8 minutes, finally got through to someone at Republic's Engineering Division. They said the proposal was still under evaluation. Additional time needed. They'd respond when the review was complete. The officer hung up and told Kowalski to keep waiting. Kowalski thanked him and walked back to the maintenance hangar. Meanwhile, the casualties mounted. The week of November 7th, 4 pilots killed, 3 gun jam incidents documented in after-action reports. Week of November 14th, 6 pilots killed, 5 gun jam incidents. Week of November 21st, 5 pilots killed, 4 gun jam incidents. Week of November 28th, 7 pilots killed, Morrison's death included in the count. 22 pilots dead in 4 weeks. 14 of those deaths directly linked to gun malfunctions. 14 men who'd gotten into firing positions and pulled triggers and gotten silence instead of bullets. Kowalski knew the statistics. Kept a notebook in his locker where he tracked every gun jam report from his squadron. Every mission above 20,000 feet. Every temperature reading. Every failure. The pattern was undeniable. The correlation was perfect. Temperature-dependent mechanical failure. He knew the modification would work, knew it with the same certainty he'd known how to fix cold weather engine problems at Ford. The solution was simple. The problem was obvious. And he had to watch men die while Republic Aviation reviewed his proposal at their leisure. The response finally arrived on December 3rd, 1943. 6 weeks and 4 days after submission. The engineering officer called Kowalski to his office at 0930 hours. The officer didn't look happy. He handed Kowalski a manila envelope with Republic Aviation's return address. Kowalski opened it. His original proposal was inside. Technical drawings, cost analysis, implementation timeline. Everything he'd submitted, and stamped across the first page in red ink. Rejected. The explanation was attached on Republic Aviation letterhead. 3 paragraphs of bureaucratic language that boiled down to 3 reasons. First, the proposed modification would void the aircraft warranty. Republic couldn't support modifications made by field mechanics using non-standard parts. Second, field mechanics lacked authorization to modify weapon systems. Such modifications required approval from Army Ordnance and the Bureau of Aeronautics. Third, the current gun configuration met all specification requirements in controlled testing environments. There was no documented need for modification. Kowalski read the rejection 3 times, each time hoping he'd misunderstood something, each time finding the same answer. No. The engineering officer watched him read it. When Kowalski looked up, the officer said, "I'm sorry, Ray. They're not going to approve it." Kowalski asked one question. "Did they test it at altitude?" The engineering officer blinked. "What?" "Did Republic test the guns at 23,000 feet in negative 30-degree cold? Did they replicate combat conditions?" The officer looked uncomfortable. "That's not my concern. The decision came from Republic's engineering division. They have people with degrees in mechanical engineering. They know what they're doing." "Men are dying because these guns don't work in combat conditions," Kowalski said. His voice stayed level, stating a fact. "Not in controlled testing environments, in combat, at altitude, in cold that makes the springs seize and the ammunition belts freeze." The engineering officer's expression hardened. "The guns work fine when properly maintained. Maybe pilots need better training on cold weather operations. Maybe they need to do better pre-flight checks. But unauthorized modifications aren't the answer." He took the rejected proposal from Kowalski's hands. "This conversation is over, Sergeant. Get back to work." Kowalski left the office at 0947 hours. He walked back to the maintenance hangar in cold December rain. England in winter felt like Michigan in winter, cold and gray and wet. The kind of weather that made you question why anyone had ever thought this island was worth living on. He reached the hangar at 1000 hours. His 12 P-47s were lined up on the hard stand, waiting for afternoon maintenance checks, waiting for pilots who'd fly them tomorrow morning into combat. He stood there looking at them for a long time. Lieutenant Horvath's aircraft, 6 gun jam reports in the maintenance log. Lieutenant Baker's aircraft, 4 jam reports. Captain Whitfield's aircraft, 8 jam reports. Tomorrow morning, these pilots would climb into these cockpits. Tomorrow morning, they'd taxi to the runway and take off and fly into German airspace. Tomorrow morning, their guns might not fire when they pulled the trigger. And tomorrow evening, some of them might not come back. Kowalski did the calculation in his head. If the modification worked, the 38% jam rate would drop to near 0. Variable tension springs maintained consistent pressure across temperature ranges. Insulated ammunition belt covers prevented the cold from freezing the feed mechanisms. Pre-flight heating brought the guns up to operating temperature before takeoff. Simple mechanical solutions to a simple mechanical problem. If the modification failed, worst case, the guns would still jam 38% of the time. No worse than the current situation. The risk to pilots was 0. The risk to Kowalski was different. Article 92 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, failure to obey order or regulation. Article 108. Destruction of government property if the modification damaged the guns. Possible charges: court-martial, dishonorable discharge, prison time. Maximum sentence: 5 years in military prison at Fort Leavenworth. He'd lose his job, lose his benefits, probably never work in the automotive industry again. A dishonorable discharge followed you forever. But pilots would keep dying if he did nothing. Morrison was already dead. Brenner was already dead. Richter and Chen and 14 others were already dead. How many more would die while Kowalski followed regulations written by engineers who'd never seen a gun jam in combat? December 3rd, 2300 hours. The maintenance hangar was empty except for Kowalski. Everyone else had gone to their barracks. The night shift wouldn't start until midnight. Kowalski stood in the silent hangar looking at Horvath's P-47, made his choice, walked to the tool locker, and pulled out his socket set. There was a damaged P-47 in the depot queue at the far end of the airfield, waiting for shipment to a rear echelon repair facility. The aircraft had taken flak over Bremen 2 weeks earlier. Engine damage, wing damage, airframe stress fractures. Not worth repairing in the field. But the guns were intact. Kowalski walked to the depot at 23:15 hours. The guard on duty recognized him and waved him through. Kowalski climbed onto the wing of the damaged aircraft and started removing gun panels. The 8 recoil springs came out easily. Standard Browning M2 configuration. Nothing special about them. Just springs designed for ground-level temperatures. Kowalski put them in his tool bag and walked to the base machine shop. The shop was closed for the night, but Kowalski had a key. Every senior mechanic did. He turned on the lights and fired up the lathe. The Springfield Rifle cold-weather bolt assembly used variable tension springs. Kowalski had measured them weeks ago when he was preparing his proposal. The design was simple but elegant. Dual tension configuration, soft initial compression for easy cycling, stiff final compression for reliable feeding. The spring maintained consistent pressure across a temperature range from 60 degrees Fahrenheit to -40. Exactly what the P-47 guns needed. Each spring took 25 minutes to machine. He worked from midnight to 0400 hours. 8 springs. 3 hours and 20 minutes of continuous work. His hands were covered in cutting oil and metal shavings. His fingers ached from holding the measuring calipers. The machine shop smelled like hot metal and lubrication. Coffee from a thermos kept him awake. The lathe hummed in the darkness. Each spring had to be perfect. Each tolerance had to be exact. If the spring was too soft, the gun wouldn't cycle reliably. If the spring was too stiff, it would bind in cold temperatures, just like the original. The margin for error was measured in thousandths of an inch. The insulation covers came from salvaged engine insulation material. A damaged P-47 had belly landed 3 weeks earlier. The engine cowling was torn up, but the insulation was intact. Kowalski had pulled sections of it and stored them in his tool locker. He cut 8 ammunition belt covers from the insulation material. Each cover wrapped the feed mechanism where the ammunition belt entered the gun. The insulation prevented cold air from flowing directly onto the belt links. Kept them from freezing. Kept them flexible enough to feed properly. Simple solution. Obvious solution. Should have been standard equipment from the factory. 0430 hours. December 18th. Kowalski installed the new springs in Horvath's 8 guns. 1 wing at a time, 4 guns per wing. Each gun had to be partially disassembled. Old spring removed, new spring installed, gun reassembled, function check performed. He worked by flashlight to avoid attracting attention. The work took 2 hours. By 0630, all 8 guns had new springs and insulation covers. Kowalski tested each gun manually. pulled the charging handle, watched the bolt cycle. Smooth action, clean feeding. The movement felt different, crisper, more positive, the way a properly functioning machine gun should feel. He set up a portable heater borrowed from the crew chief's office, aimed it at the gun bays. Pre-flight heating. 30 minutes before Horvath's scheduled takeoff would bring the guns up to operating temperature. Metal expanded when heated. Springs loosened. Mechanisms moved freely. By the time Horvath climbed into the cockpit, the guns would be ready. The risk Kowalski was taking sat in the back of his mind like a physical weight. Court-martial. Dishonorable discharge. Prison. 5 years at Fort Leavenworth if they decided to make an example of him. If the modification failed during combat and Horvath's guns exploded or jammed worse than before, Kowalski would be responsible. If the modification caused an accident, he'd be responsible. If anything went wrong, there'd be no hiding what he'd done. He didn't tell Horvath about the modification. The pilot didn't need to know. If the modification failed, there was no reason to compromise Horvath. If the modification worked, Horvath could report it up the chain of command. Let the pilot be surprised. Let him file a report saying his guns worked perfectly for the first time in 24 missions. Let Republic Aviation figure out why. Kowalski signed off the maintenance log at 0700 hours. All systems normal. Gun systems serviced per standard procedures. Aircraft cleared for flight operations. No mention of unauthorized modifications. No mention of variable tension springs or insulated ammunition belt covers. Just standard maintenance log entries that wouldn't raise questions. The mission brief started at 0730 hours. Standard bomber escort mission. Target, industrial complex near Schweinfurt. Expected enemy resistance, heavy. Luftwaffe had been aggressive over the Ruhr Valley for weeks. Intelligence predicted at least 40 German fighters would intercept. 36 P-47s would escort 72 B-17s. Horvath's flight would fly high cover at 25,000 feet. The coldest position. The position where guns jammed most frequently. Horvath taxied to the runway at 0810 hours. Kowalski watched from the flight line. Watched the P-47 roll past with its massive radial engine rumbling. Watched Horvath in the cockpit running through his pre-flight checks. The pilot gave a thumbs up through the canopy. Standard pre-flight acknowledgement. No idea his aircraft was different now. No idea Kowalski had broken 7 regulations to give him a fighting chance. 0815 hours. Horvath took off. The P-47 climbed into gray December sky. Kowalski watched until the aircraft disappeared into the clouds at 3,000 feet. Then he stood there, staring at empty sky, knowing he wouldn't know if the modification worked until Horvath returned. If Horvath returned. He went back to maintenance work. The other 11 aircraft needed service. Routine checks, oil changes, tire pressure, control surface inspections, work that kept his hands busy but didn't occupy his mind. He couldn't stop thinking about Horvath. Couldn't stop calculating everything that could go wrong. The springs could fail. The insulation could catch fire. The guns could explode from overpressure. The modification could kill Horvath faster than jammed guns would have. Every minute that passed without radio contact was good. Every minute meant the mission was proceeding normally. No emergency calls, no abort declarations, no pilot screaming that his guns had exploded. Just silence. Silence was good. Sergeant Frank Murphy noticed Kowalski's tension around 1000 hours. Murphy walked over to where Kowalski was working on Baker's P-47 and said, "You okay, Ray?" "You look like hell." Kowalski didn't look up from the oil filter he was changing. "Didn't sleep much." "Mission stress?" "Something like that." Murphy studied him for a moment. "Horvath's going to be fine. He's one of the best pilots we have." Kowalski just nodded. Murphy didn't understand. This wasn't about Horvath's piloting skills. This was about whether Kowalski had just sent a pilot into combat with guns that might explode. The radio call came at 11:20 hours. First aircraft returning to Bodny. Flight of 6 P-47s, Horvath among them. Radio chatter filtered through the maintenance hangar's speaker system. Successful escort mission. Enemy fighters engaged. Moderate damage to 2 aircraft. 1 pilot wounded but stable. Standard combat operations. Horvath's voice came through calm and professional. No emergency declarations, no mention of gun malfunctions, no panic in his tone. Kowalski's heart rate slowed slightly, not much, just enough to let him breathe normally again. 11:34 hours. Horvath's P-47 touched down. The aircraft rolled down the runway with gray smoke trailing from the exhaust. Combat damage or just a rich fuel mixture? Hard to tell from distance. As the P-47 taxied past the maintenance hangar, Kowalski counted bullet holes. 47 hits. Right wing shredded, metal torn and bent, tail section damaged. 3 rounds through the fuselage, but the aircraft was flying. The landing gear was down, and Horvath was alive. The P-47 came to a stop on the hard stand. Engine shut down. The big radial spun to a stop with its characteristic coughing sound. The canopy slid back. Horvath climbed out of the cockpit. He moved slowly. Combat fatigue. 8 hours of high-altitude flight in freezing temperatures. He stood on the wing for a moment, stretching his back. Then he saw Kowalski waiting by the wing. Horvath climbed down, walked over. His flight suit was stained with sweat despite the cold. His face had pressure marks from the oxygen mask. He looked exhausted. But he was alive. And the first words out of his mouth were 4 words that would change everything. The guns worked perfectly. The engagement happened at 08:47 hours, 23,000 feet over the Ruhr Valley. Temperature at altitude, -22 degrees Fahrenheit. The kind of cold that turned breath into ice crystals inside an oxygen mask. The kind of cold that seized metal and stiffened springs and killed guns. Horvath's flight was providing high cover for the bomber formation when 4 FW-190s appeared from the northeast. Coming in fast, diving from 25,000 feet. Standard German tactic. Use altitude advantage. Hit the bombers before the escorts could react. Horvath intercepted. Got firing position on the lead FW-190. 300 yards. Perfect deflection. The same setup he'd had 100 times before. The same setup that had failed him 11 times in 23 missions. He pulled the trigger. All 8 guns fired immediately. Not 1 gun, not 2 guns, all 8. The sound was overwhelming. 6,400 rounds per minute hammering through the wings. The P-47 shuddered from the recoil. Horvath held the trigger for 4 seconds. Continuous fire. No hesitation, no jamming. 320 rounds downrange. The lead FW-190's engine exploded. Pieces of cowling and propeller blade flew off in different directions. The aircraft broke apart at 18,000 feet. The pilot never had time to bail out. Horvath kept firing, shifted to the second FW-190. The German pilot saw what had happened to his leader and tried to break away, but Horvath's guns were still firing. Rounds walked up the FW-190's fuselage. Hits to the cockpit. Hits to the left wing root. The German fighter rolled inverted and fell away, trailing black smoke. 2 confirmed kills in 30 seconds of combat. 0 gun jams, zero hesitation, zero failures. At -22 degrees Fahrenheit. At 23,000 feet. Under exactly the conditions that cause 38% failure rates in unmodified aircraft. Horvath's guns had worked perfectly. He'd flown 23 missions before December 18th. 11 of those missions had gun jams at critical moments. 11 times he'd gotten into perfect firing position and pulled the trigger and gotten silence or single gun fire. 2 confirmed kills in 23 missions. His kill ratio was poor. His frustration was extreme. Every pilot in the squadron knew Horvath's guns didn't work reliably. Every pilot knew he was skilled enough to get kills if his weapons would just fire when he needed them. December 18th changed everything. 2 kills in a single engagement. More kills in 4 seconds than he'd gotten in 5 months of combat. When he climbed out of his cockpit at Bodny and walked over to Kowalski, the first thing he said was a question. "What did you do to my guns?" Kowalski kept his voice neutral. "Adjusted some tension settings." Horvath stared at him. "They've never fired like that. Not once in 23 missions. Today I pulled the trigger and all 8 guns fired instantly. No delay, no jamming. They just worked." "Did they work?" Kowalski asked. "Like a goddamn dream." Word spread immediately. Horvath told his flight leader, Captain Mitchell, during the debriefing. Mitchell listened to Horvath describe the engagement and then found Kowalski in the maintenance hangar 20 minutes later. Mitchell was 31 years old, had been flying P-47s since April, had 14 missions under his belt. His guns had jammed twice in the past week, nearly got him killed both times. "Horvath says you modified his guns," Mitchell said. Kowalski was working on another aircraft, didn't look up. "Adjusted some tension settings." "Can you do it to my aircraft?" "It's not authorized." Mitchell's expression hardened. "I don't care. My guns jammed twice last week. First time I had an ME-109 dead to rights at 400 yards. Pulled the trigger, 3 guns fired. The ME got away. Second time I was being chased by 2 FW-190s. Tried to return fire. 5 guns jammed. I barely made it home." He looked at Kowalski directly. "Whatever you did to Horvath's guns, I want it on mine." Kowalski made his decision. December 18th evening, he modified Mitchell's P-47. December 19th morning, he modified Lieutenant Baker's aircraft. December 19th afternoon, Captain Whitfield's aircraft. By December 20th, 6 aircraft in the 23rd Fighter Group had the modification. Kowalski worked at night when the hangar was empty. Worked alone. Each modification took 4 hours. Machine new springs. Cut insulation covers. Install everything. Test manually. Sign off the maintenance log with standard entries that wouldn't raise questions. December 20th, mission proved the modification worked across multiple aircraft. Mitchell's flight encountered German fighters at 24,000 feet. Mitchell got perfect gun performance. All 8 guns fired on command. He destroyed 1 FW-190. 0 jams. Lieutenant Baker engaged an ME-109. No jams. Damaged the German fighter badly enough to force it to break off. All pilots in modified aircraft reported immediate firing. 0 malfunctions. Temperature at altitude, -25 degrees Fahrenheit. Conditions that would normally cause 38% failure rate. Actual failure rate, 0. Mechanics talk to mechanics. News travels through maintenance hangars faster than official orders ever do. By December 21st, word had reached the 352nd Fighter Group, stationed 30 miles east of Bodny. Sergeant Thomas Riley heard about Kowalski's modification from a pilot who'd talked to Horvath. Riley didn't believe it at first. Field modifications that actually worked were rare. Field modifications that solved problems Republic Aviation couldn't solve were unheard of. But Riley was a good mechanic. Good mechanics investigated rumors that might save lives. He drove to Bodney on December 21st, found Kowalski in the maintenance hangar, asked if the rumor was real. Kowalski took him to the machine shop, showed him the spring design, explained the variable tension configuration, showed him how to cut insulation covers, demonstrated the pre-flight heating procedure. Total time to explain, 20 minutes. Riley understood immediately. The modification was simple, elegant, obvious once you saw it. "This is so simple," Riley said. "Why didn't Republic think of this?" Kowalski's expression didn't change. "They rejected my proposal." Riley stared at him. "They what?" "Submitted it in October. Got it back in December with rejected stamped across the front." Riley didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, "How many pilots died while they were reviewing your proposal?" Kowalski had done the math. 63. Riley took the design back to the 352nd. December 22nd, he modified 3 aircraft at his base. December 23rd, those pilots flew combat missions. All 3 reported perfect gun performance, 0 jams at altitude, 0 malfunctions. Riley modified 6 more aircraft. The pilots started requesting assignment to modified aircraft, started asking their crew chiefs when their guns would get the Kowalski fix. That's what they were calling it. Not an official designation, not a technical manual reference. Just a name that spread through pilot ready rooms faster than any official order. The spread accelerated. December 24th, Sergeant Murphy at Bodney asked Kowalski to modify his assigned aircraft. Murphy had watched 6 pilots come back with gun jam reports in the past week, watched them file incident reports that went nowhere. Murphy didn't care about regulations anymore. He cared about his pilots. By December 26th, 19 aircraft at Bodney had the modification. December 28th, mechanics from the 56th Fighter Group arrived at Bodney. They'd heard rumors, wanted to see if they were true. Kowalski showed them the modification, explained the procedure. The 56th mechanics took the design back to their base, started modifying aircraft. January 2nd, 1944, mechanics from the 78th Fighter Group visited. January 5th, mechanics from the 4th Fighter Group. The modification was spreading through the 8th Air Force faster than any official technical order ever had. The statistics told the story. Week of December 20th through 26th, 19 modified aircraft flew 47 combat missions. 0 gun jams reported. Week of December 27th through January 2nd, 52 modified aircraft flew 168 combat missions. 2 gun jams reported. Failure rate, 3.8% versus the previous 38%. Week of January 3rd through 9th, 96 modified aircraft flew 312 combat missions. 6 gun jams reported. Failure rate, 1.9%. Pilot testimony spread through ready rooms and officers' clubs. Lieutenant Horvath. First time in 24 missions my guns worked when I needed them. Captain Mitchell. I've gotten 3 kills since the modification. Had 2 kills in my previous 31 missions. Lieutenant Baker. I'm not dying because of jammed guns anymore. Word reached pilots faster than official channels. Faster than engineering briefings, faster than technical bulletins. Pilots started requesting assignment to squadrons that had mechanics who knew the modification. Started asking their crew chiefs if they'd heard about the spring replacement that made guns work at altitude. Engineering officers noticed something had changed. Gun jam reports were dropping dramatically. November average, 47 jam reports per week across the 8th Air Force's P-47 squadrons. December average through the first 3 weeks, 41 jam reports per week. December 4th week, 19 jam reports. January 1st week, 11 reports. January 2nd week, 7 reports. The curve was unmistakable. Something had changed. But the maintenance log entries didn't explain what. Mechanics were logging the modification as routine maintenance or tension adjustment. Nothing that would trigger questions, nothing that would require explanation. Officers didn't ask questions because pilots weren't dying anymore. The casualty rate was dropping. Mission effectiveness was improving. Whatever was happening in the maintenance hangars, it was working. Better to let it continue than to investigate and possibly disrupt it. The Luftwaffe noticed. German fighter pilots filed after-action reports through their chain of command, just like American pilots did. On January 10, 1944, Allied intelligence intercepted and decrypted a German fighter pilot report. The translation read, "American P-47s engaging with more consistent firepower. Previous advantage of their gun malfunctions no longer evident." German intelligence officers noted the pattern change in subsequent reports. American fighters were firing earlier, sustaining fire longer. Kill rates were improving. Something had changed in American tactics or equipment. German analysts examined the reports trying to determine what. The most common theory was that American pilots had received better training, better maintenance procedures, better cold weather operations doctrine. Nobody suspected a field modification because field modifications weren't supposed to work that well. German tactical adjustments followed. Before the modification, German pilots knew P-47s often had gun problems at high altitude. Standard tactic: force American pilots to fire early at long range, where accuracy was poor. Wait for the guns to jam, then counterattack while the Americans were clearing malfunctions or fighting with reduced firepower. The tactic had worked reliably for months. Now, it was failing. After the modification, German pilots found themselves facing P-47s that fired consistently, that sustained fire through entire engagements. That didn't give them the half-minute vulnerability window that came with jammed guns. German pilots started reporting that the Thunderbolts are more dangerous now. Intelligence couldn't explain why. The P-47 hadn't changed. The armament was the same. The specifications were identical. But somehow, American fighters were more lethal. The numbers quantified what German pilots were experiencing. December 1943, 73 German fighters shot down by P-47s. January 1944, 124 German fighters shot down by P-47s. 70% increase. Same number of American aircraft. Same combat conditions, same weather, same operational area. The only variable? Guns that actually worked when pilots pulled the trigger. German intelligence examined captured P-47s looking for new weapon systems, looking for modified guns, looking for anything that would explain the improved performance. They found nothing. The modification was invisible from outside. Variable tension springs looked identical to standard springs unless you disassembled the gun and measured them. Insulated ammunition belt covers looked like original equipment. The only visible difference was a slight discoloration on the insulation material where it had been cut from salvaged engine cowling. German intelligence officers examining the guns saw standard Browning M2s, standard configuration, standard ammunition. Nothing to explain why these guns worked better than the ones they'd been fighting for months. The psychological impact went beyond statistics. German pilots were losing confidence in their previous tactical advantage. For months, they'd pressed aggressive attacks on P-47s, knowing the American guns might malfunction, knowing they could survive the initial firing pass and counterattack during the vulnerability window. Now they had to approach every P-47 as a fully functional threat. Had to assume every gun would fire. Had to fight more cautiously. Caution meant fewer kills. Fewer kills meant losing the air superiority battle over Germany. German tactical doctrine changed in response. Directives came down from Luftwaffe Command. Do not assume American gun malfunctions. Do not press attacks on P-47s unless you have significant altitude or numerical advantage. Treat every Thunderbolt as maximum threat. The aircraft that German pilots had learned to exploit was now an aircraft they learned to avoid. One mechanic's unauthorized modification had shifted the psychological balance of the air war over Europe. And German intelligence still couldn't figure out what had changed. On January 15, 1944, a Republic aviation engineering team arrived at Bodny Airfield. They'd come to investigate reports of dramatically improved gun performance. Gun jam rates had dropped from 38% to 4% in 1 month. Something had changed. The engineering officer ordered maintenance logs examined. But the logs showed only routine maintenance entries. Nothing explained the statistical impossibility they were witnessing. The Republic engineers examined modified aircraft. Initial inspection showed guns that appeared completely normal. But detailed teardown revealed non-standard recoil springs and insulated ammunition belt covers. The lead engineer asked who had authorized these modifications. Silence from the maintenance crew. Then Kowalski stepped forward. "I made the modifications," he said. The engineer asked under whose authority. "My own," Kowalski replied. The engineering officer wanted Kowalski court-martialed immediately. Unauthorized weapons modifications violated multiple regulations. But Kowalski presented the statistics. Pre-modification: 38% jam rate, 63 pilot deaths in November and December 1943. Post-modification: 4% jam rate, 11 pilot deaths in January 1944. 52 fewer deaths in 1 month. The Republic engineer examined Kowalski's original proposal from October, tested the springs under temperature stress, and reached a conclusion that changed everything. The modification is sound. It should have been part of the original design. We rejected this proposal because we tested at ground level. We didn't account for combat altitude temperatures. The Republic engineer intervened before the court-martial proceedings began. If you court-martial the man who saved 52 pilots, you'll create a public relations disaster. The fighter group commander agreed. The modification works. That's all that matters. Decision: no court-martial. Condition: Kowalski must train other mechanics on official modification procedures. On January 22, 1944, 8th Air Force issued Technical Order 44-1-23. All P-47 aircraft would receive the cold weather gun modification within 30 days. Credit given to field maintenance innovation. Kowalski's name was not mentioned. By February, Republic integrated the modification into P-47 D-25 production. Variable tension springs and insulated ammunition belt covers became standard equipment. Total cost: $14 per aircraft. Total aircraft affected: 12,602 P-47s built after February 1944. The modification spread beyond P-47s. P-51 Mustangs received it in March. P-38 Lightnings in May. British Hawker Tempests in August. Gun jam rates dropped to 0.7% by May 1944. P-47 kill-to-loss ratios improved from 0.7 to 1 to 2.3 to 1. Statistical estimates credited the modification with saving 340 pilots' lives. Kowalski never received official recognition. He returned to Detroit in July 1945, worked at Ford until retirement in 1978, and died in 2003 at age 87. His obituary mentioned he was a World War II veteran. It did not mention the 340 pilots. But those pilots remembered. In 2001, survivors installed a plaque at Bodny Airfield. The inscription read, in memory of Staff Sergeant Raymond Kowalski, whose unauthorized modification saved more American pilots than any authorized order ever did. Sometimes the most important heroism is knowing when to ignore the word rejected.